donne juste 2 minutes, je sais pas si ce sera. Il est 10 heures maintenant, j'attends. Mais elle est à la work arbitrage, donc... So it's 10 a.m. I'm giving 1 minute to see if Maria... Don't worry, I will manage to catch her. I'm not worried about her. So, if you are okay, I'm going to launch the event. Is it okay with you? It's 10 a.m. Geneva time. Many of you are logging in. So let's wait 30 seconds to formally launch this event. It's 10 Geneva, so I think we are launching, we are now officially launching this event. Excellencies, dear colleagues, good morning to who is with us at the International Environment House, and good morning, good afternoon, or good evening to who is with us on WebEx or is now watching the video of this event. The Geneva Environment Network and Switzerland have the pleasure to welcome you today for the event Climate Tipping Points, Irreversibility and Their Consequences for Society, Environment and Economies, discussing Switzerland's proposal for an IPCC special report. Leading experts have joined us today to lay out how the crossing of tipping points in the climate systems may impact society, environment and economies across the globe. Before we proceed with the opening remarks of this event, and I hand over to the moderator of today's journey, Dina Ionesco, manager at the United Nations Climate Secretariat. She's well known by the international climate community in Geneva and beyond. Let me remind for those who are online with us that you can raise your questions by using the Q&A box, which we will address in the Q&A session of this event. To launch and welcome you to this event, it is my pleasure to give the floor to Sebastian Koenig, the Chief Scientist of the International Affairs Division of the Swiss Federal Office for the Environment, and also Switzerland's focal point for the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Sebastian, over to you.
Thank you very much. Excellencies, dear colleagues, 418.9 parts per million. That is the level of CO2 in the atmosphere today. That number is already at levels last seen around 4 million years ago in the Pliocene epoch, when temperatures were about 3 degrees higher than today. 7 meters, that's the equivalent of global sea level rise that the Greenland ice sheet holds. We now measure that Greenland is losing ice at the fastest rate in 350 years. My own research over 10 years ago intended to look into this particular warmer than present time period, the Pliocene. We wanted to understand how sensitive large systems like the Greenland ice sheet are and what the future may hold. Back then, the Greenland ice sheet was almost lost entirely. We could show that once the ice is lost, it requires levels of CO2, half of the current levels, and orbital configurations of the Earth favorable for ice to grow, taking up multiple thousands of years to grow back the ice. Politicians, economists, and even some natural scientists have tended to assume that tipping points in the Earth system, such as the loss of the Greenland ice sheet or the loss of the Amazon rainforest, are of low probability and little understood. Yet evidence is mounting that these events could be more likely than was originally thought. The slide shows by crossing such a tipping point, the Earth is entering a new stage of a climate regime, which is irreversible, at least for a long period of time. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC, introduced the idea of these tipping points 2 decades ago. At that time, these large-scale discontinuities in the climate system were considered likely only if global warming exceeding 5 degrees C, above pre-industrial levels. However, new information suggests that tipping points could be exceeded even between 1 and 2 degrees of warming. Representatives at this meeting are now wondering why they should be concerned about the fate of the Greenland ice sheet. The answer is twofold. First, the climate biosphere system is interconnected. That means that crossing a particular tipping point will lead to feedbacks, cascading effects, and to changes elsewhere on the globe, taking us to a different climate regime. Professor Stocker will be diving into details on that later on. Second, it will have significant social and economic consequences. And on these consequences, we will hear from our distinguished panel on how societies and economies will be and are already impacted. So given the high interconnected nature of the tipping points and given the far-reaching consequences for mankind, we need a comprehensive understanding of the tipping points and their implications. It is hence highly policy-relevant information. The IPCC is the right authority and delivers the quality for such a report. Therefore, Switzerland sees it as pertinent to call for a special report by the IPCC in a new cycle that will start by 2023. We ask governments and other stakeholders to sign up and join our proposal. A first step will be to have COP27 to mandate the IPCC to undertake such an assessment. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Sebastian. I hope you can hear me well. I just come closer to the microphone. Hello, everyone, and I'm very pleased to be today to have the honor to moderate this amazing, excellent, forward-looking roundtable. I would like to thank, first of all, the Geneva Environment Network and Switzerland for pulling this together and bringing us here and online. And to really thank Sebastian Koenig for these excellent introductory remarks that I think help us understand that we speak of very concrete examples. You gave, for instance, the Amazon forest example. We speak of climate systems, thresholds, and understanding of tipping points, and I think the event today speaks to us in a very normal way, in a way that every person, I think, understands in its own life what a tipping point means. So you already introduced also a key element of irreversibility, for instance, in the discussion. So our panel today will be developed as follows. We will have first an introduction, presentation about the proposal for the IPCC special report from Professor Thomas Stocker. And so I will introduce in a moment, and then also we'll have then a panel with 5 speakers who bring different perspectives, more from the scientific, environment, climate dimension, or from issues that are key in terms of human and social and economic dimensions, such as health or displacement issues. And we then will have time for some open discussion as well, and then a closing of the event today. So I propose we go ahead. And so I'm extremely pleased to introduce Professor Thomas Stocker, who is Professor of Climate and Environmental Physics at the Physics Institute, University of Bern. And you are also the president of the Oeschger Center for Climate Change Research. And you will give us an introduction, an explanation, a presentation of this proposal for this important proposal that you are making for an IPCC special report. So the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Dina, for this nice introduction. Excellencies, dear colleagues, it's a pleasure to be with you today and to be able to present to you the proposal of Switzerland for an IPCC special report on climate tipping points and their implications for habitability and resources in the 7th assessment cycle, which by all means likely will happen and start in 2023. IPCC has laid a great foundation to look into this topic in more detail by, for example, this figure here, which shows that the temperatures in the last 2,000 years have increased to a level that is unprecedented in that time. Not only the level is unprecedented, but also the rate of change is unprecedented. And in order to get a larger context, it's useful to actually look back 60 million years. That has been done now by IPCC in the Working Group 1 contribution as well. You see here two graphs. On top, the carbon dioxide concentrations as estimated 60 million years ago to 1 million years ago, and below the global surface temperature change during that time. You see the very tight correlation, which is not surprising, between the major greenhouse gas carbon dioxide and the global mean temperature, as these greenhouse gases and their variations modify the Earth's energy balance. We have even more precise information about these two parameters in the climate system over the last 800,000 years, thanks to polar ice cores, in particular those from Antarctica. If you put that together with the projections, first the historical development over the last 150 years, and then the projections that were presented in the 5th assessment report, you see the context of the changes that lie ahead of us in only the next 200 years, 250 years, with respect to the last 60 million years. The world has the potential to be rather different from now. You see here the evolution of the temperature on a map from the last 60 million years to today. And the scenarios, high emission scenario on top, the SSP 8.5, and the mitigation scenario, which is Paris compatible, below on the time horizon of 2100. At the time horizon of 2100, for the mitigation scenario, we're looking at a world in which people are able, in most regions, to adapt to the impacts of climate change. In a world, however, where SSP 8.5 would be realized, this is no longer guaranteed, and many areas on this planet will actually go beyond the limit of habitability. So it would be surprising in such a project, prospect, if tipping points were not realized, and therefore we think that this is a real danger that needs to be assessed in a more profound way. Indeed, tipping points have happened in the past. As this graph shows, during the last ice age, we had about 26 events where scientists believed that tipping was the element that actually triggered these abrupt temperature changes that we see in the Greenland ice cores on top, and consequent changes around the globe registered here in the red curve as temperature variations that are correlated with the abrupt changes in Antarctica. So tipping points are not a figment of a mathematical model, but in fact our planet has a dynamics that is able to show, both on a global scale but also on a regional scale, tipping points. In fact, science has progressed since the last 20 years to identify step by step possible non-linear processes in the climate system, essentially the interaction between the atmosphere, the ocean, and the land surface, including vegetation, to identify a number of tipping elements. Some are already present in the literature as robust knowledge, others are more speculative, but that is the state of the science at the moment. Let me show you a few examples of what the scientists have found out. Here, for example, one of the most discussed tipping points associated with the Gulf Stream in loose terms, but more precisely with the northward extension of the wind-driven circulation in the Atlantic Ocean. The system has been monitored since 2004, and you see here the data, absolutely unique oceanographic data. I want you to focus on the red curve. Lots of variability, and now people sometimes look at trends. You could actually see a decreasing trend, but you already recognize that this conclusion is by no means robust. You could also have such a trend here, and this is really one of the points that we feel that a careful assessment according to the rules and custom of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change would really be useful to bring together all the literature and the scientific insights and the scientists around the table to find a consensus on where we stand in our understanding of that tipping point. In fact, the current literature is not unequivocal. There are studies who argue that already the developments of the surface temperature in the Atlantic Ocean, as you see here, is an indication of an approaching tipping point. Other studies would argue that this is still in the realm of natural variability. And you also appreciate with the data that we had before, 20 years of observations isn't really long enough to distinguish one from the other. Another tipping point that was already mentioned in the introduction is associated with the mass balance of the large polar ice sheets. This is a particularly dangerous tipping point because it means that through the sea level that is increased by meltwater from these ice sheets, everybody on the planet is affected, in particular megacities, which are housing more than hundreds of millions of people around the world. You see here particularly concerning the data from satellite missions from Grace here in Greenland. The mass balance is not only decreasing, but the decrease is actually accelerating, and the same diagnosis can be and must be done in Antarctica. You see the red and purple lines here also showing an acceleration of mass loss. Currently, Antarctica is losing about a third of the mass that Greenland is already losing. It's by the simple fact that Greenland is overall about 20 degrees Celsius warmer in its environment than Antarctica, and so Antarctica is far removed from a tipping point. But that doesn't apply to the local conditions of these ice sheets. Here is a prominent example from Pine Island Glacier. Pine Island Glacier is in West Antarctica, close to the peninsula. It's one of the glaciers that has been identified to be a potential triggering point of large ice loss. Satellite measurements indeed indicate that the velocity of that glacier has increased tremendously over the last few years. You see that in this graph. You see the velocity being increasing by hundreds of meters per year until the year 2020. And then on the right side of the graph, model simulations that would suggest that actually this ice stream is self-stabilizing. But that is just one study. Other studies are around that argue that the tipping point has already passed with that individual outlet glacier from Antarctica. This again indicates that an assessment by IPCC would be extremely useful to inform public and policymakers about the state of knowledge. I have another example here why it is important to address tipping points on regional climate change, and that is associated with the El Nino Southern Oscillation phenomenon. You see the normal El Nino here in the left panel, and the right panel a model simulation how the world would be under 4 times the CO2. In other words, a completely different El Nino phenomenon which would impact particularly the coastal communities of South America. In fact, what the studies, the most recent studies show is that the El Nino would actually lose in amplitude in a warmer world. This is an information that would be crucial for fisheries to plan and adapt to climate change and tipping in that element. If we now open up and look how the outside world actually looks at the topic of tipping point, then we must state that there is a lot of confusion in the public. You see here a few examples that argue that tipping points are just around the corner, and we need to be shocked about that information. Others would argue that tipping points are rather an element that occurs in the modeling realm, and therefore observations are not really confirming that issue. So I think here we can safely conclude that some clarification, some assessment that comes out with a consensus, and where there is no consensus, with a clear declaration that in that topic there is no consensus, would be extremely useful. Global research programs have started seriously to focus on tipping points. Here, for example, a program of Future Earth that has issued an overview of tipping point research in terms of paleo research. WCRP, the World Climate Research Program, has launched a lighthouse activity, or a series of lighthouse activities, in which they also focus, among other things, on tipping points and high impact, low likelihood events. That is also reflected in an ongoing discussion series that you can follow on tipping elements, irreversibilities, and abrupt changes in the Earth system. That has been started and launched last year and is still ongoing. Let me now reflect a little bit on what the IPCC has done on that topic of tipping points. Indeed, in the third assessment report, surprises in the climate system were presented, and unexpected events and abrupt climate change was featured in various parts of the report, but in an uncoordinated way, because it was kind of a new topic at that time. In AR4 2007, focus was indeed on the Atlantic meridional overturning circulation. That's this northward extension of the Gulf Stream. Polar ice sheets have been around in the literature for many, many years, and that was assessed in the fourth assessment report as well. In the fifth assessment report, which I had the pleasure to co-chair with my Chinese colleague Qing He, we addressed tipping points. Now more specifically, we also looked at the irreversible changes in all climate system components, impacts, but we had to report the fact that the studies were not really numerous at that time to warrant a deeper consensus finding process during the fifth assessment cycle. In the current cycle, which comes to an end soon, we have the special reports on ocean and cryosphere. You see here, tipping points are already featured prominently, for example, in the technical summary, and that is also the case for the comprehensive report of Working Group 1, where they identify 14 reasons of concern. You can see the list here, I won't go through that. They also decided at the technical summary level to feature a box on tipping points that would inform policymakers on the state of knowledge. Just note that this box is only like 1.5 pages long. The important communication on the risk of tipping points and other climate change related risks is usually expressed in these burning amber diagrams, which are very easy to read. If you identify the 2 °C target to which we should stay considerably below according to the Paris Agreement, you see that large-scale singular events, which is another expression for tipping points, are already in the reddish area at that temperature, and of course the risk is increasing rapidly as you would pass even in an overshoot manner, as is now discussed as scenarios for this change. Tipping points, however, occur at all scales. It's not just the global tipping points we're concerned with, but even more so tipping points associated with weather systems, with systems that concern the hydrological cycles and ultimately resources of people. The 14 reasons of concern I've mentioned, I've highlighted those in red that involve tipping points that are already present in the literature. You see this is a growing list, and so there is material to be assessed in the 7th assessment cycle. I'm proposing a special report. Why a special report? You know about the approach of IPCC. A special report on a specific topic allows you to involve a good number of authors around the world who are working specifically on that topic. That means that you can reflect the knowledge base in a special report to a much greater and deeper extent than just addressing that topic in a special box somewhere in an assessment report. That is the reason for special reports, and the function of it is nicely illustrated in the special report on extreme events that was commissioned in the 5th assessment cycle and was published in 2012. I can tell you from own experience that this has accelerated in a tremendous way research on that very topic, and that is the reason why AR6 is able to say much more and much more relevant things about extreme events, changes in statistics intensity around the world. This is of crucial importance, and therefore a special report is really an instrument not only to provide a consensus but also to boost the knowledge in the long term. In closing, I just present you an extract of a proposed table of contents. What is really important here is that I think it's of key to address impacts, that is working group 2, and economy, working group 3, all topics that are still in their infancy, but I think it would be extremely useful to involve these communities when it comes to tipping points, because ultimately that's the information that people need to make decisions at their community levels. And I conclude here that brief presentation by saying again, tipping elements are reasons of concern already now. Their global and regional impacts pose key risks for humans and ecosystems alike. A comprehensive scientific assessment of tipping points and their regional impacts is missing. We don't have that information. We don't have a comprehensive consensus finding project, and they are also, these tipping points, not yet part of IPCC scenarios. And I think this is a big lack. A special report would certainly put that on the table and make the scientific communities think about scenarios. Therefore, again, I very much support, obviously, the call for a special report. I think it's an opportunity that should not be missed in the 7th assessment cycle. It's important to involve, especially working groups 2 and 3, that is on impacts and socio-economic processes, because only a comprehensive assessment of a special report that involves all 3 working groups would provide the actionable knowledge for decision makers to address that important topic. Thank you very much for your attention, and I apologize for the rather fast pace of my presentation, but 15 minutes or just 15 minutes. Thank you very much.
And thank you so much, because it's indeed 15 minutes.
Oh, it was.
Yeah, so
Okay.
I also would like to say thank you for bringing us this knowledge and also your talent to transform the complex issues in things we can understand, I think, from also perspectives of people who are not necessarily the scientists that work on this on a daily basis. And I also think that you clarified for us very important things about the IPCC process, because it's important to understand this importance of having the possibility of a consensus, of mapping what's there, bringing the knowledge together, and also recognizing maybe if there is no consensus, what do we do out of this, and then also the importance of boosting, in fact, knowledge more broadly, thanks to such a report. I think we saw it in many different domains related to climate issues, for instance, in the migration domain, and I would highlight also the program Habitable, that is about tipping points and irreversibility and thresholds that in connection to displacement and migration. I find extremely good example also for the examples that you presented. And another point, it's also the impact on media. You showed some examples. So thank you for bringing us already at this point at the beginning of the presentation we have today. So now we'll move to the panel discussions. And I will introduce the first speaker from our panel, who is in fact online, if I'm correct, yes. Yes, right. So I see already on the screen Maria Nera, who is the Director of the Department of Public Health and Environment at the World Health Organization. So thanks to you, Maria, we'll have the chance to go also into health impacts. You have, each of the speakers for the panel has 5 to 6 minutes. And so the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. An excellent presentation before, Thomas, and fantastic, and of course a great initiative to convene all of us here. Let me start by saying that probably you heard already this, and WHO has been saying it now for a while. I think it's a very strong statement that we needed here, is the fact that climate change is the biggest public health threat that is facing humanity at the moment. I think with that statement probably we could already end my presentation here, because I think it's strong enough to justify how much concerned we are and how much we will be supporting any initiative that will allow us to accelerate and put at a real scale the actions that are needed to face this major public health issue that we are facing. Maybe something a little bit provocative as well to start. I saw those 14 reasons of concern that just presented by Professor Stoker, and definitely if it was in my hand, I will add on number 1 the issue of human health, and the fact that probably humans we will not be able to survive. And I think this human face on all of this, linking the issue of climate change with how much this will be affecting your health, our health now, not just in the next generation or because of the planet. It's just linking it as much as possible will allow us as well to further motivate, engage citizens, put political pressure, and I think this is coming very much. The health argument is very much, or at least we are trying to put as much as possible the health argument at the center of all of this debate, and giving as well some positive narrative, because we need the citizens to engage and to feel that they have a role and not to be paralyzed by the messages. So how is climate change impacting our health? In a very synthetic way. One, because when we have natural disasters, storms or floods or heat waves, obviously that will result in death and injuries and illness. So that will be already a critical resource. With the increase of all of those natural disasters, we are very much concerned about how this is impacting very concretely, on a very clear way, the health of the people, and even causing very long-term diseases and death, immediate death. The second way that climate change is impacting our health is because it increases the so-called climate-sensitive diseases. Means there will be more foodborne diseases, so diseases transmitted by the fact that we put at risk the food production, and obviously you can understand that there will be malnutrition, or there will be diarrheal diseases linked to this problem of malnutrition that will accelerate and increase the possibility of having more diarrheal diseases, linked as well to the lack of access to safe water. So foodborne diseases, vector-borne diseases, the mosquitoes or other vectors will find the perfect conditions to grow, to reproduce, and therefore we will see more diseases like dengue or malaria. And I think everybody is now very sensitive to the issue of zoonotic diseases. You know how those diseases transmitted from animals to humans, because we are not respecting this ecosystem barrier. We are not respecting the human health, animal health barrier, environmental health is one health concept I think is very present in all the discussions at the moment, for obvious reasons, linked to the pandemic, linked to the fact that we will see more emerging infectious diseases due to the fact that we are destroying ecosystem biodiversity and this natural barrier and deforestation or agricultural practices. And then, since I already mentioned diarrhea and cholera and other epidemics, but imagine that these three things, foodborne, waterborne, and vector-borne, are the second pillar of how climate change is affecting us. We need to add another critical one that we see more and more, which is mental health. Climate change is having an incredible impact on mental health, and we will soon produce a second report on all of that. But the third pillar of all of this is that climate change is touching the pillars in which we sustain our health, which is access to safe water, access to food, access to clean air, and access to shelter. And if you destroy those four pillars that are really the basic to protect human life and human health, then we will be suffering. We will have massive displacement with all what this represents. And the issue of clean air, I think, is fundamental. As we know, every year now we have 7 million premature deaths, 7 million premature deaths caused by exposure to air pollution. How is this air pollution produced? It overlaps, not 100%, but it overlaps at least on a 75% with the causes of climate change. So for us, this is a great opportunity. Tackling the causes of climate change will generate enormous health benefits, particularly coming from this reduction in the pollution of the air we breathe that is killing us literally. It's coming by the combustion of fossil fuels on a big proportion, so a common cause here. And second is coming, the second huge health benefits will come from healthy diets that we will have by having a more sustainable food production and consumption. And the third one will come from the healthy urban planning, and how we will plan our cities on a different way that will protect us and have more energy efficiency, renewables, all of those changes that are needed to implement the Paris Treaty. At the end of the day, the Paris Treaty for us, for the health community, is a public health basic treaty. So we can obtain enormous benefits. That's why we are so much involved on the climate change negotiations and debates, presenting the health argument for more action, because we are convinced that this can be a very strong engine to motivate people to act. People understand the connection between air pollution and health, and maybe they don't see as clear the climate change and health, but when you explain this overlap and you tell them that this is asthma, this is lung cancer, this is stroke, this is all of those diseases that they understand, this generates a movement that is certainly something that we should take advantage of. To finalize, just to say that at one press conference when we were talking about the WHO air quality guidelines and then how we need to promote the air quality, and we were talking about the linkage with climate change, one of the journalists said, okay, can you tell us what will be the situation of human health if we go beyond the tipping point? And I say, I don't want even to imagine that, and I don't think you want to have it, because the moment you present that, people start to accept. So it's unacceptable for us going beyond. So put, please, the health argument and your main points of concern, because this is something that for us, we are reaching very quickly the tipping points for health and for public health, and this is of major concern. Thank you all, and back to you, Nina.
Thank you so much, Maria. I think food, water, air, shelter, pollution, I think if we don't get it, that health is at the center. Yes, I don't know what to say more. Thank you so much for bringing this so strongly to us. We move now to the second panelist who is in the room with us today. So I have that great pleasure to introduce Alexandra Bilac, who is the Director of the Internal Displacement Monitoring Center, IDMC, based here in Geneva. So we will now focus more on the climate change related displacement questions. Thank you so much, Alexandra. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Dina, and good morning to everybody, Excellencies and colleagues, and thanks for inviting IDMC to this discussion. I think it's really commendable that Switzerland and the Geneva Environment Network have managed to pull together such a complementary panel, and I'm afraid I'm going to be adding to the very sobering presentations that we've just had to give you a perspective on some of the another dimension of the human impacts of climate change when it comes to displacement in particular. So I'll just start with a brief presentation of the latest data that we do have that is available on global disaster and climate-related displacement across the world, and what this means, and then I'll just say a few words about how this connects to the theme of today's discussion on tipping points and issues of irreversibility and in this case, uninhabitability. So we released just last Thursday, our 2022 global report on internal displacement. And what this report shows is that internal displacement is very much a global phenomenon, and that we have now reached already global or record levels of such displacement. The majority of people living in internal displacement today have been displaced originally as a result of conflict and violence. But what we're seeing, if we look at annual figures, we see that actually every year the most common drivers of movements and of the dynamism of internal displacement is mostly weather related and disaster related. So last year alone, disasters, mostly weather and climate related sudden onset disasters, triggered 23.7 million displacements. And the majority of these displacements occurred in East Asia and the Pacific and took the forms of storms and floods. Commonly every year we report high numbers of displacements in 3 countries, which are China, India and the Philippines. Most of this displacement is in the form of evacuations, and one could think that this then means that this displacement is short-term and is easily resolved, which is actually not the case, because what we see within these evacuations is that when you're looking at someone's house being destroyed or damaged to such an extent that they can no longer return, and that it's going to take them so much more time because they are, they may not have access to insurance, or they may have lower levels of income, you can imagine that displacement becomes prolonged over time, and as I'll come to in a minute, can even become permanent. What we saw in 2021, the numbers were slightly lower last year than they had been in previous years, which was mostly linked to the fact that the Atlantic hurricane season and the rainy seasons across South Asia and Africa were less severe, and they therefore led to fewer movements than the year before. But nevertheless, the phenomenon still occurred in around 70% of the world's countries and territories, so it very much has a global footprint. We also reported in 2021 drought conditions and extreme temperatures that caused wildfires across the Middle East and North Africa, but also in areas of North America and Europe. So this is not just an issue that is affecting lower income countries, but also high income countries. I think it's important to say that it's very hard to establish a direct sort of causal relationship between climate change and displacement. And in fact, what we're seeing is that today people are fleeing multiple threats that are caused by a combination of political, but also environmental, of course, social and economic factors. So we see conflicts combined with weather and climate disasters that are causing increasingly protracted forms of displacement. And just to say that, as if this wasn't already enough, what we've seen also very recently is that the COVID-19 pandemic and now the war in Ukraine, which is pushing global food prices up, are very much compounding these crises. They're exacerbating people's vulnerabilities, and they're creating situations that are becoming more and more difficult to resolve, We've seen this across, for example, areas of the Pacific in the early days of the COVID-19 pandemic that were still being hit by hurricanes and flooding, and where governments were literally unable to evacuate people or to provide shelter, because at the same time they were having to respect social distancing measures. And that led, of course, to very complex forms of vulnerability, where people literally were not being provided with immediate humanitarian assistance following those disasters. The effects are being felt most strongly, as I said, in low and middle income countries, or even within poorer and disadvantaged communities within higher income countries. Right now, parts of Africa are going to be entering their 5th consecutive failed rainy season, and they are hard hit by a global rise in food prices, which has led to acute food insecurity and put millions of people at risk of famine. Now, together, of course, with conflict in many of those areas, this is leading to people becoming displaced repeatedly and facing now the risk of a permanent loss of homes and livelihoods. We can really certainly no longer dispute the relationship that exists between conflict, disasters, food insecurity, and displacement. If you look at the 4 countries in the world with the highest numbers of severely food insecure people, which are DRC, Yemen, Afghanistan, and Syria, they are also the countries, they are also conflict-affected countries, and they're among the 5 with the highest numbers of IDPs. I was interested to hear Maria talk about the mental health dimensions, and what we've shown within these countries as well is that there's how children are disproportionately affected within these crises. So if you think about conflict, displacement, and malnutrition or food insecurity, you can also see that there's a correlation with school closures and children seeing their education cycles interrupted as a result of this. And this is having a number of, it will have a number of knock-on effects for their future, social and economically speaking, but it also has a direct impact on their mental health. So we also need to consider the costs that this is likely to have for future generations. Do I still have a couple of minutes?
You have a couple of minutes, but the next speaker has to be
Okay. Okay, well then let me just give a couple of other concrete examples of how, because obviously we've been trying to quantify and to put, to collect data and generate evidence on how the slow onset effects of climate change are driving displacement. There's very little available evidence out there, precisely because it is very much a multi-causal phenomenon. But what we do, there are 2 areas where there's growing evidence. One is that global sea level rise is causing, of course, damage to coastal infrastructure, loss of territory, and that all of this means that more people are exposed and vulnerable to sudden onset disasters and to an increased risk of displacement. This is particularly relevant in small island developing states, given their low elevation, their limited territory, their dependence on natural resources, and it means that they're already having to think about the permanent relocation of these communities. This isn't specific to the Pacific region, we're also seeing it in other countries from Indonesia to Senegal. Desertification as well is another example of how slow onset effects of climate change are contributing to people forced out of their homes. If you think about, I talked about areas of Africa that are experiencing low crop productivity. This is causing their livestock to no longer be able to use pasture, and it is forcing them to either move into other forms of income generation and to switch from different types of livelihood, but it's also causing some people to move out of these areas into urban areas where oftentimes they receive no assistance. Most of the time these people then drop off the radar screen, and it's impossible to then understand what their needs look like, and then of course provide the support that is needed. So there are all sorts of examples across the world of how these tipping points are going to increase future global displacement. And to perhaps echo also the question that Maria was saying she gets from journalists who are trying to kind of anticipate or project into the future, we get the same question: what is this going to mean for displacement? Are we talking about hundreds of millions of people fleeing? And in some kind of cases the question comes, are they coming to Europe? Are they coming to the US? And I think our answer is very similar to Maria's. We'd rather not have to think about it. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Alexandra. This was so interesting, and I propose if you have other examples, we can come back to them in the discussion, because I would like just to introduce immediately our next speaker, who unfortunately has to leave, so won't be able to stay for the discussion, but is with us online. So I have the pleasure to introduce Ms. Sabine Pabst, who works the Environmental and Climate Destruction and Asia Coordinator at CAN International. Thank you, Sabine, for being with us. The floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you very much. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everybody. And yeah, thanks a lot to the organizers for organizing this very important and very interesting event. And it comes very timely, and I already appreciate all the insightful and interesting presentations which I was able to listen to. FIAN International is an international human rights organization focusing on the human right to adequate food and nutrition. And I would like to focus a little bit on the relation between the right to a clean, healthy and sustainable environment and the right to food and nutrition, as both those rights are closely connected. And we have to consider in this context that the main driver actually of our present triple planetary crisis, now which has a lot of implications on the tipping point issue, like climate destruction, environmental pollution and the loss of biodiversity. So the main driver, one of the main drivers, is the prevalent industrial food system, which covers a whole range of issues. For example, the input, supply and production of crops, fish, livestock and other agricultural commodities, then the transportation, processing, retailing, wholesaling, the preparation of food, the consumption and the food disposal. So all these aspects are related to the food system. According to calculations, at least 1/3 of all greenhouse gas emissions are caused by it. So this is important to know, and there are also calculations that this amount is even more. And all the processes linked to the food system are linked to huge fossil energy consumption and the related negative impacts on the climate. The destruction of biodiversity, through deforestation and peatland conversion, and as well the application of fertilizers and pesticides and their impacts on soils, water bodies and air. At the same time, the industrial food system is also responsible for an increased vulnerability of large parts of the population through a combination of factors. For example, through the destruction and pollution of water sources and water bodies. The availability of clean water is critical for irrigation, but also as a source of fish and other forms of aquatic life. The destruction of fertile farmland, forests, pastures and all biodiversity. Soil degradation is a massive problem. And soil degradation, mainly caused by deforestation and industrial agriculture, depending again on the respective calculation, but is already at 1/3 of all fertile soils, which are considered as degraded. And the future scenario sees that 90% of all soils will be degraded in 2050. It is marginalized and disadvantaged groups who suffer most from these impacts. Small-scale food producers, including small and marginal peasant farmers, indigenous people, agricultural workers, herders and other small livestock keepers, rural artisans, small entrepreneurs, they are most affected as they experience direct impact on their livelihood resources without possibilities of coping mechanisms. For example, they are usually not able to use irrigation or install pump sets, etc. They usually do not have alternative income possibilities due to lack of education or assets. They even very often do not have the possibility to migrate because they lack literally the resources for it. Another important factor which is worth mentioning is that the industrial food system relies on the global market and international trade, and thereby also causing increased vulnerabilities. For example, for the agricultural workers who already work under precarious and often informal conditions and can be dismissed at any time. The COVID pandemic and as well the ongoing war on Ukraine are some recent examples with regard to disturbances related to the global market and international trade. Therefore, the promotion of agroecological practices and the transformation of the prevailing food systems towards sustainable and resilient systems based on agroecology is an urgent need. This is part of the international obligations under the human right to adequate food and has been highlighted, among others, by the Special Rapporteur on the Right to Food, Michael Capri. Finally, I would like to stress what we have experienced in our work with different communities all over the world. It is important to note that communities' rights to land, food and the environment are not only threatened by our prevailing systems, but their rights are also essential to address the climate crisis, including the dangerous consequences related to the tipping points and other consequences. Strengthening community and indigenous land rights and promoting agroecological food production are among the missing links in climate change mitigation. They are important bottom-up solutions and so far receive very little attention in official climate summits and reports, but they are key to develop sustainable and just solutions. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Sabina, for bringing this into the discussion, and I see a lot of connection with the former presentation by Alexandra also on vulnerabilities, marginalized groups, and the complex connections that we see between food, displacement issues, and of course these tipping points at the heart of our discussion. So thank you so much. I know you can't stay with us for the follow-up, so thank you for being with us today, and I pass now the floor to our next speaker, who is the head of the United Nations Environment Programme Finance Initiative, Mr. Eric Usher. So, Eric, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Dina, and a pleasure to be with you all today for this very important discussion and we believe important development that can go forward. I think I have the distinction of being the one non-scientist on the panel, okay.
Social sciences.
However, I will speak from the perspective of a users group that obviously finds the topics that Alexander's talked about is incredibly important. It's also a new users group of the science, and that's the global financial community. And so the UNEP Finance Initiative, we're a long-standing program within the UN, partnership between the UN and 450 of the mostly larger banks and insurance companies from around the world. We establish global frameworks for responsible conduct within the finance sector, and I'm going to talk about two areas of these frameworks and how they work today and what their relevance to the science. If we talk about climate, I have to talk about climate disclosure. And later I'll talk more about climate action. But in terms of disclosure, publicly listed companies, so companies that are listed on stock exchanges, are required legally to disclose, so report on all financially material risks to their business, so that those who buy their stocks, whether it's households or it's investors, are aware of all risks that the company operates within. As part of the Paris COP21, there was the launch of what was called the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, a very awkward acronym called TCFD, which put together a set of recommendations for how should corporations start to disclose on climate risks today. And it was a voluntary framework to start with. Now, what's challenging for a corporation or a bank or an investor is that to understand climate risk, you can't look back in the past of what happened. You need to be able to be predictive and looking forward. So the science, for the first time, really starts to become key to the actions of most corporations today. They need to start to be predictive. They need to understand scenario models. In the case of a bank or investor, they need to start stress testing their portfolio, their investment portfolios, to basically say what happens under a 3-degree, 4-degree world. Which of parts of our investments are actually going to fail because the physical climate risks or the transition risks, the policies and the technology innovations that are going to come with a climate transition. And so this has led to a lot of work on figuring out how do you set these norms on how we should disclose on these risks. Initially voluntary, and that's where I mentioned the work that we do, and that led to most big corporations today in the last 5 years, have started to disclose on climate risks. So it's a very, very important development. The quality of disclosures has varied, but regulators have now started to pick up on this, and they basically say we have a breadth of disclosure, but now what we need to do is improve the depth, so the comparability of disclosures, so that we really get a proper idea of the risks that different sectors are playing. And so this relationship between voluntary action within the private sector and regulatory action has been working quite well together. We actually call it a dance of how you move forward. So the finance sector, for the first time in most corporates, learned about the IPCC there and really have a very important appreciation for it, as the tools that it provides. And also, I would say the other work that is derivations from the IPCC, and I would point out the International Energy Agency, because the IEA provides very important modeling or projections on the energy markets. And when they put out a climate scenario, you're already plugged into the financial and economic system, and therefore they absorb and they are able to take better decisions based on it. However, climate disclosure on itself and climate risk management is not enough. You know, a real cynic would basically say, if your scenario is most likely pointing towards a 5-degree world, then you just alter your portfolio to do well in a 5-degree world, and that doesn't solve the world's problems, obviously. So we need much more than climate disclosure, and we actually go beyond to the area of climate action. And very importantly, within the Paris Agreement, there's a paragraph 2.1c, which was, and as everybody knows with these agreements, there are many different paragraphs which have helped initiate action in many areas. 2.1c basically says that the parties to the agreement will work towards aligning the financial flows, public and private, to align with the objectives of the Paris Agreement. And there's been a lot of work around climate disclosure and other work to say, well, how do we get the financial sector working in alignment with the objectives of the Paris Agreement? And so in COP26 in Glasgow, people might have heard about the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, another awkward acronym, GFANZ, in which we've been very much involved with, which is basically different parts of the financial community starting to actually set targets, so actually choosing the scenario that they want to work towards, and then starting to adjust their portfolios, where they're putting financing to help deliver on that. It's mostly focused around a 2050 target for zero emissions. That's the easy part. The challenging part is which model do you use, IPCC, IEA, and where do you need to be in 2030, 2025? Because predicting something for 3 decades out is much easier than actually saying, well, how do we actually start to get started in 2025 based on the scenarios? How much do we need to reduce emissions? One of the sort of the leading group, which we convene within the GFANs, is the investors, the asset owners. So these are pension funds and insurance companies. And they have the 2050 target, but then they've issued a target setting protocol for 2025 reductions. So essentially, it uses a model, it uses the One Earth model out of the University of Technology, Sydney, to actually say, well, to get to zero by 2050, we actually need to reduce by 2025 in the range of 25 to 30% of our emissions within our portfolio in 3 years' time. And they've now started to issue how exactly they're doing it, and they've started to make these reductions. Very importantly, this group has established a scientific advisory body. It's the first time that we're aware of a financial group to say, actually, we need scientific advisors to help us figure out how to move forward. So with continued policy uncertainty on climate action, what we're seeing within the financial community, they're looking through policy making. Frankly, it's not the most reliable in some markets, and they're actually saying, if you can look at the science, you can see where the world is going scientifically, you can actually be predictive of how markets are going to change and how regulations are going to change to adapt to what needs to be done. And there's a body of research called the Inevitable Policy Response, which basically says if you're in a market where there hasn't been a sufficient policy response on climate action, that's actually not a reason to sit back. That's actually a reason to pay more attention, because inevitably, when the policy response comes, and by looking at the 420 and 430 parts per million in the atmosphere, you can watch that ticking upwards, you know that there's going to be a policy response. And the later that response comes, the more brutal it's going to be. So essentially, it's a warning to those who believe that there's not a price on carbon in my market today, to actually say, well, if there isn't one, that you better pay very close attention, because when it comes, it's not going to be incremental, it's going to be something that's going to totally change the markets you operate in. So in conclusion, finance sector is a new user of climate science. I think the financiers have always kept an eye towards market tipping points. And there's an academic named Hyman Minsky, who has a concept called the Minsky moment, which financiers are terrified of. And that's basically the idea that all of a sudden market sentiment can change and market values can collapse overnight. And that's actually happening right now in the markets to many sectors, including the tech sector. And so they know the concept. They see the new value or the need to understand the science on the climate side. And so I think if the IPCC is to go forward in this area with regard to tipping points, it's very important, because there's no lack of information out there. The problem is creating knowledge out of information. And the IPCC plays such an important role for actors like the financial community or corporates more generally to actually understand which model should they be looking at. The IPCC has sort of set the standard, and then to use that to factor it into making sure that they're playing part of the solution. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Eric. I think also it's very interesting this, is it okay? Yeah. How much we have to transform indeed what we know into knowledge, so information and all the science base. So that brings us back to also the fact that we are here in a meeting discussing the proposal for a report. So I now would like to go to our last speaker to really give us the view on the timeliness of this proposal and to bring us back really to the heart of this tipping points focus. So I have the pleasure to introduce Jörg Lutherbacher, who is Director, Science and Innovation Department and Chief Scientist at the World Meteorological Organization, WMO. So Jörg, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the invitation to give you also a short intervention at this important and timely event with full support to the Swiss initiative from the World Meteorological Organization. Excellencies, colleagues, last week the WMO published its 2021 State of Global Climate Report, and the UN Secretary General's reaction to the report was dismal litany of humanity's failure to tackle climate disruption. Greenhouse gas concentrations sea level rise, ocean heat levels, and ocean acidification all set new records in the last year. A series of alarming and exceptional events were recorded, including the first ever recorded rainfall at the summit of the Greenland ice sheet at over 3,000 meters. The State of the Global Climate Report made it also clear that many glaciers across the world are close to a tipping point, a point of no return for their continued existence. It's not just glaciers. As we heard, ice sheets in Greenland and West Antarctica are being closely monitored for signs of abrupt changes. Deforestation, climate change, and changes in land use are destabilizing the Amazon rainforest, home to 1 in 10 known species. Since 1970, almost 20% of the Amazon rainforest has been lost. The climate indicators from the report suggest we are edging closer to tipping points in the oceans, the cryosphere, as well as the atmosphere. In addition, the United Nations Convention to Combat Desertification launched the second edition of its flagship publication last month, the Global Land Outlook. It made clear that 4 out of the 9 planetary boundaries have already been exceeded: climate change, biodiversity loss, land use change, as well as geochemical cycles. Other boundaries, such as ocean acidification, are also close to threshold levels. These boundaries or tipping points define a safe operating space for humanity. We are now risking further widespread, abrupt, or irreversible environmental changes as the habitability of our planet decreases and we move ever further away from the safe operating space. The research landscape related to tipping points, irreversibility, and abrupt change is thriving, as we got a nice overview from Professor Stocker. And colleagues also raised the issue about potential implication and impacts. Indirect response to an awareness that sudden and unexpected shifts in Earth climate are increasingly likely with a changing climate. As also mentioned by Professor Stocker, since September 2021, the World Climate Research Programme, which is a WMO co-sponsored programme, together with IMIS and the Earth Commission, Future Earth, have been running a successful discussion series on tipping elements, irreversibility, and abrupt change, exploring the latest research on tipping points and building a community and looking primarily at high-impact, low probability events. The next webinar will take place next month in June on paleoclimate insights on societal collapse. How did climate influence the collapse of ancient civilizations? And I'm happy to share with you more information later on. More events are planned for September to December of this year, which will advance our knowledge about tipping elements, irreversibility, and abrupt changes in the Earth system. For instance, tipping points from climate crisis to positive transformation, which will combine the scientific aspects with the political dimensions. And GCOS, another co-sponsored program of the WMO, will organize a large climate observation conference in mid-October of this year in Darmstadt with a focus on climate extremes and also tipping points. Last but not least, under the leadership of Professor Thomas Stocker, there will be an important short contribution on tipping points and irreversibility to this year's United in Science report, which is a multi-organizational, high-level compilation of the latest climate science information to be launched in September of this year and to show awareness of the subject. We are all here today because no action is required and needed. The crossing of tipping points in the Earth-ocean climate system will impact society, the environment, and economies alike across the globe, as the previous speaker have highlighted. That is why the WMO, as one of the parent organizations of IPCC, strongly supports the Swiss initiative for a new IPCC special report on climate tipping points and their implications for habitability and resources, which will galvanize additional progress in the crucial next years. Thus, WMO will be very happy to be part of the next steps in making this become reality. Thank you very much, and back to you, Nino.
Thank you so much, Jur, for this very clear, I find, conclusion going across everything that we discussed, and also on the timeliness, so connecting to other events and reports that gather towards the same dynamic to push for that. So we have now come to the end of the panelists discussion. So we have, I think, 15 minutes for exchanging and then closing this session. So I propose we take some questions here in Geneva from the colleagues and friends who are in the room, and then we have also some online questions, and we'll see how we then can respond and then close the panel. So I open up the floor if there are questions here in the room. Yes, and please introduce yourself.
Should I click the button? Hello, my name is Philip. I'm a youth delegate from the International Federation of Medical Students Associations. My question is generally directed towards Dr. Nera, but also if anyone else from the panel would like to speak on this, I would love to hear it. I would like to come back to the issue of mental health mentioned earlier. As you've said, children and young people in general are particularly impacted by the consequences of climate change. Considering the mental health impact of these effects, we can assume there to be an ever-rising need for mental health support structures, which are currently lacking in most countries. What do you think are measures we as youth and our governments can take right now to prepare for these events? Thank you.
Thank you so much. Key question of the mental health. Is there any other question in the room? Otherwise, I can introduce a few of the questions online. We have another question in the room.
Hello, I'm Juliette. I'm from the Netherlands and also from the International Federation of Medical Students Associations. And I was wondering, we as youth are also very worried about the impact on climate change and health, and we're very happy that you asked Maria Nera to come here and to explain that to you too. But we see in our own health communities and as well in the academic communities some hesitancy to call for action. So what do you think the role should be of the academics and maybe the frontline health workers to take a stance on climate change, and how can we convince our colleagues to engage in politics, maybe more political questions, so to say?
Thank you so much. Very clear question as well. I have some questions online, and if there are other questions here in Geneva, we can take them as well. So I have a question online from Yves Lador from Earth Justice to all panelists. It's a very specific question on how you would describe the difference between tipping points and planetary boundaries that both are often used in international discussions but don't always contribute to a clear understanding of the situation. And then I have two other questions online, very specific as well. One is from Kevin Bourne, who is related more to your introduction presentation, I think, Thomas, on why are we not analyzing all the 14 tipping points as a single block of analysis? And there are also some question that it's much more specific on how you can capture, in fact, tipping points in different models that already exist. So I think there's the integrated assessment models, IAM, and the couple model interconnection project. Is it correct? Yeah. So that's another question. And then I have another question online from Issa Tussar that brings us back more to the question also around economics and systems and the question of resources. So the question is, can you please comment further on the mitigating measures of economic impacts of the tipping points in the climate system, in particular in settings that are resource limited? And also, environmental tipping points can alter cost-benefit analysis, and which justifies, in fact, much more stringent climate policy, which takes the form of a higher immediate price on carbon. So the question is, I think it's more a remark, this last point, but also if any of the panelists would like to respond to those. So we have quite a number of questions now. I think we should go back to our first questions on health. Back to Maria, who is I see online. Yes, please.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the questions, and I'm very conscious of the very short time we have, so very quickly. Mental health, yes, we are working with our colleagues on the Department of Mental Health, looking at how can we solve the problem that many countries, they will not have those services that are required. Clearly, the young professionals, the young health professionals, they need to play a role on that, on incorporating, we are trying to incorporate on the curricula of the medical school the issue that climate change is a health. The role of the youth is very, very important. That's why at COP27, together with bringing the health arguments and the positive arguments for doing more action, using the health as a very strong, powerful motivation, we will convene a youth movement and defining very clear what would be the next steps. Clearly on advocacy, your voice is very important, but as well as health professionals, and this links to the other questions, what is the role that health professionals can play? More and more we see professional corporations, pediatricians, all type of health professionals joining us on this call for more action in climate change. You saw even demonstrations very recently, and you saw the millions of health professionals that joined us signing the health argument for climate change last year at the COP26, more than 45 million people from the health professional. This is nothing. We need to reach, we need to multiply that number by 10, and for that we count on you as well to help, but we need to make this argument very powerful among our health professionals, because our health depends very much on that, and this is clearly, as I said before, the Paris Treaty is nothing else than a basic public health treaty, if implemented, can bring enormous benefit for health, and if not, the problem for health will be huge. If I can, on economic, very quickly as well, on the mitigation. One of the problems we have on the health sector is that the externalities, I mean the cost of the externalities generated by combustion of fossil fuels has never been considered from a health point of view. Means that every year the global health system spends 5 trillions every year on treating the patients and taking care of the chronic diseases generated by this exposure to the combustion of fossil fuels, for instance, but those externalities are not considered when economics are done around the mitigation of climate change. So we could perfectly, the trade-off will be incredible. People who says that they don't have enough resources to invest on mitigating climate change, they should consider that they are already spending fortunes in money, but as well on the cost for the well-being and the health of their citizens. Thank you, over. And we are still, every minute, we are still giving 400 billion of subsidies to fossil fuels while we are paying them the consequences in our hospitals. Sorry, over.
Thank you, Maria. This very strong message. I hope it responds and can continue this discussion with the representatives from the Youth Medical Association. Is the correct name?
It's IFMSA.
International Federation of Medical Students, and you are 4 in the room. More, even. Oh, bravo. Quite a number of representatives in this room. Bravo. So I add just one quick question before going back to you, because there's a question that goes across again and touches upon also the question on health and displacement from Ole Christian from Norway. I don't have more the name or if there's an affiliation, but just to say that he raises the question on how a special report on tipping points would really be able to address the migration, displacement and health issues. And he also raised a bit the question that is it a bottleneck and how to overcome the fact that for these topics, or more generally, IPCC always relies on existing literature more than developing new, possibly peer-reviewed research. And so the link with IPCC Working Group 3, is it challenging, and how to overcome this? So you have the other questions. I go back. Should we start?
Thank you very much for that range of questions. In fact, it's a pleasure to see a whole class of medical students here in the room, because I think it's really an emerging field. The public knows, thanks to more than 30 years of IPCC work, quite well about climate change. All of us know a lot about health due to personal experience, but the two things together, that is the emerging conscious. And I think that's really important. I see now in several universities, in particular in institutes of social and preventive medicine, people, scientists emerging who actually address directly the field of climate and health. For example, at the University of Bern, we carried out a study last year that demonstrated that 37% of heat wave related mortality can be attributed to anthropogenic climate change. Just reflect for a second the importance of that message to the public and to policymakers, that climate directly impacts on health. I think it's important in the near future to have that quantitative knowledge base increase substantially, and that means medical people working on large databases that draw from observations from the climate system, bring that together with physiological and medical information, cohort studies, etc., to actually increase the knowledge that then can be incorporated into assessment processes such as the IPCC or other bodies that carry out assessment processes. Regarding the difference between tipping points and planetary boundaries, planetary boundaries, in my view, is a much more overarching concept to demonstrate that through all the changes that man inflicts on planet Earth, we're actually going beyond habitability, whereas tipping points are processes in the climate system, not only global as the planetary boundaries are, but mostly also regional, that impact directly on people's well-being in all places of the world. So tipping points, I think, are indeed different from the planetary boundary concept. There was a question how to address tipping points in models. I can only here say that this is an ongoing scientific activities across the hierarchy of models, both from the comprehensive general circulation models that are assessed in CMIP exercises, present and the future, as well as integrated assessment models. There I should reiterate that IPCC has not yet developed scenarios that include tipping points, and hence tradition has it that these IAM models have not yet really taken up that topic. Then the last question I want to very briefly respond to, how could a special report actually be helpful for migration and health? Well, the fact that an IPCC special report is commissioned starts the working of the brains of hundreds, if not thousands, of scientists to collect the information that is out there. And it's true, IPCC is sort of backward looking on the literature that is existing, but I presented the example of the special report on extreme events that actually triggered the scientific community, the funders and the world programs of research to actually address that topic, and so bringing long-lasting value to our knowledge in triggering new research. And that can be expected also from such a special report, that while at the date of publication this just reflects what we know now, but a few years from that, a lot of knowledge will be generated that will be helpful in forthcoming cycles of the assessment, at which time We would hope that tipping points is a standing element in all of these assessment reports. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Let's continue by Alexandra. Thank you.
Thanks very much, and thanks for these questions. I'll just react to two questions that were posed here. One on the economic impact, and Maria already answered that question when it comes to health-related costs. Just to also say that IDMC has also quantified the financial cost of providing assistance to displaced people today, which is already globally, it stands right now at $21 billion, which only encompasses the cost of providing, as I said, direct humanitarian assistance in the immediate crisis following a displacement situation, and doesn't estimate all the cumulative effects that we often see in protracted displacement situations and that can extend over time. So this is really a significant underestimate, but it's already a remarkable number when you consider that it can also represent up to 10% of the country's GDP, if you look at countries like Syria or Somalia right now. So again, the cost of inaction today is going to be much higher in the future. And then the second question, which was about really, what you were talking about mental health, but you were asking about the types of structures and government's capacity that is going to be needed to accommodate this issue in the future. The same question is very relevant for displacement, and what we're seeing is that there's obviously lower income countries are already bearing the brunt of these climate-related impacts and the displacement that comes with it, but also are lacking the capacity to adequately monitor and track the situation of their displaced citizens and communities over time. So we are investing a lot with our partners to help build adequate governmental structures through improving existing monitoring and reporting systems, and connecting the knowledge and the information that exists on displacement to countries' commitments under the SDGs and their development objectives. For that, there needs to be much more collective effort, much more funding that goes to such initiatives, and this is where we see the biggest gap. But the positive is that there is much more ownership now, much more leadership shown by governments around the issue of displacement. I dare say also in the public health sector. And I think it's now a question of investing much more in collecting and compiling good practices that can then be shared and that governments would have access to. So for a future IPCC report, I'm sure that will also be one of the areas of focus. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Alexandra. This is very clear. Eric, would you like to respond to?
I mean, I think just to restate the wider potential and need, and the reality is it's very hard for economic actors today to make sense of the climate science without having credible information for them to understand. And of course, the understanding is of physical climate risks, but also the responses to climate change, which in themselves are also, the examples I gave before, are very hard to actually appreciate. Things like, what's the ability of policymakers to actually put a price on carbon, and in what ways, and what impacts will that have on the markets? So I think bringing together the key actors to actually try to create that knowledge in itself can be a tipping point, I think, in the ability of markets to respond to a changing climate and the need to respond to these changes.
Thank you. This was also extremely clear message. We are just a tiny bit over our time. I wanted just to go back also to Jörg online, all the more that we received the last question. I just say very quickly, do we need to strengthen global monitoring of climate tipping points, for instance, by building on advancements in availability of high-frequency satellite imagery? It's a very specific question. I just pull it back to Jörg, and then we go back to Sebastian.
Yeah, thanks very much for the question, and I think I can be very short. This is really an important point that should be done. So fully support of this suggestion that this needs to be done.
This was short and very clear.
Thank you very much, and thank you, thanks to the panel and all the experts and interested parties that are attending this event. I keep it brief on my end as well. We see that there is a clear need for this topic to be further explored, being on the science side, but we also see that if we are going into the subject of tipping points, and we may be able to pull together a complete picture of the tipping points, what it means at a global scale, but also as it has been mentioned for the regional and local scale, and for many sectors, be it finance, be it displacement, health, etc. We will see that there's a clear need to pull it together, a complete picture of what it means if we are approaching certain tipping points and crossing those thresholds. So I believe that at this moment of time, I'd like to refer to our next step. We will have as a Swiss official side event at the upcoming Substan SPI meeting in Bonn. We will also have a similar event on this topic to further explore also with certain governments how we can best approach the process towards getting to a special report by the IPCC, and that's from our side the next step. Thank you very much from my end.
Thank you. Thank you, Sebastian. That was also a very clear way forward. To conclude, really conclude again, because I've been concluding for a few minutes already. The conclusion of the conclusion. I still want to go back. If you want to give one message, each of you, what would it be? And then it's the conclusion of the conclusion. Okay? And while you are thinking about it, what I will do is just to really thank again the organizer. I really want to thank Diana Rizzolio, who is on my side over there, who is the coordinator of the Geneva Environment Network, to thank her for all her work and the team working with her. And to say how well organized these events are. I'm always saying chapeau for that. So now that I said this, and I will not say anything else after, I just go back. If we can take maybe online, so I go first, gentleman first for one, so Jörg.
Thank you very much for this great event. So my summary would be tipping points are really reasons of concerns for all of us, as their impacts at local, regional, national, and global scale will be associated with major risk for ecosystem and humans, as we have heard. Therefore, WMO fully supports the initiative for a IPCC special report on climate tipping points and their implications for habitability and resources. And I really hope, as many of you highlighted, that many countries will follow. Thank you.
Thank you. I go now to Maria.
Well, tipping points in human health are absolutely unacceptable to go beyond, so whatever initiative we support to make sure that we will never reach that tipping point, because human health will simply disappear. Thank you.
Thank you, Maria. Eric?
I would say in a world of increasing uncertainty, economic actors are looking to the science to help provide them with direction. And for a topic like tipping points, I would hope that economic actors don't rely on the Twitter sphere to understand the implications, but actually look to the IPCC to actually create good knowledge that they can act upon.
Thank you. Alexandra?
Well, I was saying earlier that it's difficult to establish today a direct causal relationship between climate change and displacement, but what we know for sure is that in the future climate change will increase the frequency and the intensity of the hazards that we're already seeing today, and therefore will increase the risk of future global displacement. So there is a huge cost involved in not reversing the trends that we're seeing today, and indeed we have to prevent reaching these tipping points, because as in the same way that Maria said, the implications for human lives and global displacement will be huge.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm convinced that policymakers and the public need better knowledge from the host of information that is out there in the scientific literature, and that knowledge can be provided by a special report on tipping points carried out by the IPCC in the 7th assessment report. The science and the scientists are waiting to carry out that assessment across all 3 working groups, not only the natural science and the climate science, but also the impact and risk science, as well as finances, health and technology. We're waiting.
Thank you. Let us just imagine when we have to go back, complete assessment on that, and we're open and open to stakeholders and governments who want to join us in our proposal for the special report. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and I think with this we can conclude this event. Bye everyone.
Thank you very much also to you, Dina, for efficiently moderating this event. Thank you to all the panelists, to all those who were online with us, and those who made it to the International Environment House today, and those who will be watching this video later. And just a slide to announce our upcoming events that you can see on the screen. And we are running 11 minutes behind the initial schedule, so you are not free to go. Thank you very much.